James's life has been ruined by injustice and prejudice. But when he makes a choice to return a lost ring to a wealthy woman, the world begins to change for him. What happened next? Find out in this touching story. Subscribe to our channel to not miss new stories, and be sure to write in the comments, what would you do if you were James? James sat on the cold, hard concrete, his back pressed against the rough brick wall of an alley, watching the world pass by in hurried indifference. The day was gray, like the many before it, blending into a continuous stream of days marked by hunger, cold, and the stinging bite of rejection. To anyone walking by, he was invisible, just another face lost to the streets, a man whom society had forgotten. But once, not long ago, James had been someone. He had a family, a career, a future. Now, all of that was gone. His mind often drifted back to those better days when life still had promise. He had been a dedicated father and husband, working long hours to provide for his wife and young son. His job in construction had kept food on the table, and though they weren't wealthy, they had each other, and that had been enough. Everything began to change the day he was passed over for a promotion. James had been with the company for over 10 years, working his way up from the bottom, earning the respect of his colleagues. But when a managerial position opened up, the promotion went to a younger, less experienced white man. James was left with nothing but vague excuses about company culture and fit, but he knew the truth. It had been about race. It always was. The rejection hit him hard, but it wasn't just the promotion that he lost. Soon after, budget cuts were announced, and James found himself among those let go. His savings ran out quickly, and before long, the mounting pressure at home began to take its toll. His wife, already burdened with her own stress, became distant. Arguments over money and their uncertain future escalated. The love they had once shared seemed to vanish, leaving behind only resentment and silence. James tried to find work, any work, but the world was not kind to a middle-aged black man with no formal education. Doors were slammed in his face, and each rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of his former life. The bills piled up, the eviction notice came, and eventually his wife left with their son, leaving James alone with nothing but his pride and his memories. And so, he had ended up here, on the streets, reduced to begging for change just to survive. Every day was a battle for dignity, and every night a struggle to stay warm. He had learned quickly that people rarely gave money to someone who looked like him. The few coins he managed to collect were often thrown at him with disdain, accompanied by muttered accusations of laziness or worse. Another black man wasting his life away, they thought. They didn't know his story, and they didn't care. The cold wind bit at his skin, reminding him that winter was coming. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around him, trying to conserve what little warmth it provided. His stomach growled in protest of the single piece of bread he had eaten earlier. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at him day and night. He had long since grown used to the ache, but some days the emptiness felt unbearable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, James stood up and made his way toward a more crowded part of the city. The busier streets were his only chance at collecting enough money for a meal. He walked with his head down, shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might see him as a nuisance. He had learned to make himself small, to disappear into the background. It was the only way to survive. People brushed past him without a second glance. Businessmen in tailored suits hurried to their next meeting. Shoppers with bags full of expensive clothes and gadgets laughed and chatted, oblivious to the man who moved among them like a ghost. They didn't see him. They never did. But James saw them. He saw the way their eyes slid over him, as if he were something less than human, something to be avoided. He saw the way they clutched their bags a little tighter, crossed the street a little faster, just to avoid getting too close. It wasn't just his homelessness that made them uncomfortable. It was his skin, his very existence in their world that felt like an intrusion. And no matter how hard he tried to hold on to his dignity, every sideways glance, Every whispered word reminded him that he was unwanted, that he didn't belong. As he made his way to his usual spot near the corner of 6th and Main, he found it already occupied by a group of teenagers, laughing and smoking as they leaned against the wall. One of them, a tall, skinny boy with a cocky smirk, eyed James as he approached. "Hey man, this is our spot. Get lost." James stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. This had been his spot for weeks, a small stretch of sidewalk where he could sit and at least try to earn a few coins. But he knew better than to argue. He wasn't in a position to stand his ground, not anymore. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his feet dragging along the pavement. He didn't know where else to go. Most of the good spots were already taken by other homeless people, and he didn't want to encroach on their territory. It was an unspoken rule on the streets: respect others' space or face the consequences. He wandered for a while, aimlessly moving through the streets as the city lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the bustling night. He passed by restaurants where the rich dined on meals that cost more than he had made in the past month. He could see them through the windows, laughing and enjoying the warmth of their comfortable lives, while he shivered outside in the cold. By the time he found a new place to sit, the night had fully settled in, and the streets had begun to empty. He sank down onto the curb, pulling his jacket tighter and staring out at the quiet city. The pang of hunger returned, sharper this time, reminding him that he still hadn't eaten. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the world, trying to escape the reality of his situation, if only for a moment. But the memories came rushing back. The sound of his wife's voice as she left, the look on his son's face as they drove away, the endless parade of rejection that had followed. Each memory was a reminder of what he had lost, of the life he could never get back. As the night grew colder, James felt the weight of his existence pressing down on him. He was tired, so tired, not just from the physical exhaustion, but from the emotional toll of it all. He had spent so long fighting, trying to hold on to hope, but now that hope felt like a distant dream, something he could no longer reach. He was just about to drift off into the restless sleep that often overtook him on the streets when he heard the soft click of heels on the pavement. His eyes fluttered open, and he saw her, a woman walking toward him, dressed in an expensive coat, her long blonde hair catching the light of the nearby street lamp. She looked out of place in this part of town, her appearance radiating wealth and privilege. As she approached, James instinctively lowered his gaze, expecting her to pass by without a word, just like everyone else. But to his surprise, she stopped in front of him. He glanced up, confused, as she rummaged through her purse. "Here," she said softly, dropping a few bills into his hand. James blinked in disbelief. It wasn't often that people like her acknowledged him, let alone gave him money. He mumbled a quiet "thank you" as she smiled and turned to walk away. And then it happened. Just as she moved to leave, the woman accidentally knocked something from her hand. A small object fell to the ground, catching the light as it tumbled across the pavement. James watched as it rolled toward him, coming to rest near his feet. It was a ring, a diamond ring. James's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the piece of jewelry. Even in the dim light, he could tell it was valuable, far more valuable than anything he had ever owned. The diamond sparkled, reflecting the light from the street lamps in 1,000 tiny facets. The woman, oblivious to her loss, continued walking, disappearing around the corner and out of sight. For a long moment, James sat frozen, the ring lying just inches away from him. His mind raced, torn between the temptation of the fortune lying at his feet and the gnawing voice of his conscience. That ring could change everything for him. It could be his ticket off the streets, his chance to start over. But at what cost? His fingers twitched, reaching toward the ring. He hesitated. What should he do? This was no ordinary decision. This was a test of everything he believed in, a test of his integrity, his soul. The world had taken so much from him, his job, his family, his dignity. Would it be so wrong to take something back? But deep down, James knew the answer. The ring glinted in the dim light, its brilliance too powerful to ignore, as if mocking the dullness of James's life. He sat there, frozen, his fingers hovering inches above the ground, where the diamond ring lay as though waiting for him to make his choice. The night air grew colder, biting at his exposed skin, but James hardly felt it. His thoughts were racing, caught between temptation and morality, each fighting for dominance in his mind. The world had been cruel to him, taking and taking until there was nothing left but the shell of the man he once was. The universe owed him, didn't it? How many times had he been on the receiving end of someone else's prejudices? How many doors had been closed to him because of the color of his skin? How many times had he been turned away, accused of things he had never done, all because people judged him by his appearance, his poverty, his race? Now, here lay a gift, a chance to turn his life around. He looked around, his breath coming out in short, shallow bursts, checking to see if anyone had witnessed the woman drop the ring. The street was quiet, nearly deserted now, with only the soft hum of traffic in the distance. No one had seen. No one knew. It was just him and the ring, alone in the stillness of the night. I could sell it, he thought. Just this one thing. The money from selling the ring would be more than enough to get him off the streets, at least for a while. He could find a cheap room, get cleaned up, maybe even buy a decent suit and go out looking for work again. It could be the fresh start he needed, a chance to rebuild the life that had crumbled away from him piece by piece. But even as these thoughts surged in his mind, another part of him recoiled. What would happen to him if he took the ring, gave in to the temptation? Could he live with himself knowing that he had stolen something from a woman who, for all her wealth, had shown him a rare moment of kindness? That woman had given him money without hesitation, without judgment. She hadn't treated him like he was beneath her. And this was how he would repay her? He groaned softly, gripping his head in his hands, trying to shut out the warring voices in his mind. No, this isn't who I am. This isn't the man I was raised to be. He could hear his father's voice in his head, as clear as if he were standing right next to him, reminding him of the values he had been taught. His father, a man who had worked hard every day of his life, despite the odds stacked against him, had always told James to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it might seem. Your dignity is all you've got in this world, his father had said. Don't let anyone take that away from you, and don't give it away either. James clenched his fists, his father's words echoing in his mind. Dignity. He had lost so much, but this was something he could still hold on to. If he kept the ring, he might gain temporary relief, but he would lose something far more valuable, his sense of self, his integrity. And once that was gone, what would be left of him? His decision made, James reached down and picked up the ring, holding it in the palm of his hand. It was heavier than he had expected, and as he studied it, he could see the intricate details of the design, the craftsmanship that had gone into making such a beautiful piece of jewelry. This ring wasn't just valuable because of the diamond. It was a symbol of wealth, of privilege, of a life he could never know. And yet, in this moment, he held it, and it was his choice what to do with it. He tucked the ring carefully into his pocket, determined to find the woman and return it. But where would he even begin? He hadn't gotten a good look at her when she passed by. She had been just another face in the crowd, another wealthy pedestrian in the sea of people who moved through the city without a second thought for men like him. But he had to try. His mind was made up. James rose from the curb, his legs stiff and cold from sitting so long. He glanced up and down the street one last time, making sure no one had been watching. There were only a few late-night stragglers now, people hurrying home from bars or restaurants, none of them paying any attention to the homeless man standing alone on the sidewalk. With no other plan, he started walking in the direction the woman had gone. His steps were slow at first, unsure, but with each step, his resolve grew stronger. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she lived or where she had been going, but he was determined to find her. It was the only way he could live with himself. As he walked, the streets began to clear even more, the nightlife winding down and the city quieting under the weight of the approaching midnight hour. James wandered through the maze of streets, retracing the woman's path as best he could, though he knew it was a long shot. He passed high-end boutiques and closed restaurants, their windows dark and empty now, a stark contrast to the bustling activity they held during the day. The further he walked, the more futile the search began to feel. The city was too large, and she could have gone anywhere. But still, he pressed on, hoping against hope that he might find a clue, some sign of where she had gone. He glanced at every restaurant and cafe, hoping to catch a glimpse of her blonde hair or her expensive coat. But with each block he passed, his hope dimmed. After what felt like hours of searching, James found himself standing outside a large, brightly lit restaurant. The place was full of well-dressed people, laughing and clinking glasses inside. Through the large windows, he saw waiters moving briskly between tables, carrying plates of gourmet food. It was the kind of place where the woman might have gone, where people like her spent their evenings enjoying luxuries he could barely imagine. He took a deep breath and approached the door, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. Immediately, he felt out of place. The warmth of the restaurant hit him like a wave, a sharp contrast to the cold night air outside, and the smell of rich food made his stomach growl painfully. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort that made him uneasy, it was the looks. The instant he stepped through the door, he felt the eyes of the diners on him, their curious glances quickly turning to disdain as they took in his appearance. James had become used to this reaction. He had seen it so many times before. The way people's eyes narrowed when they saw a homeless man in a place he didn't belong. The way they shifted uncomfortably, as if his very presence was an intrusion on their world. But tonight, he didn't care. He wasn't here for them. A hostess approached him, her expression one of practiced politeness, though her eyes betrayed her discomfort. She glanced at his ragged clothes, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight. "I'm looking for someone," James said, keeping his voice steady. "A woman, blonde hair, expensive coat. I think she came in here earlier tonight." The hostess hesitated, her gaze flicking over his shoulder as if looking for someone to tell her what to do. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not sure who you're talking about. We've had a lot of people in tonight." James nodded, not surprised by the answer. He had expected this to be a long shot, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "Could you ask around? Maybe one of the waiters saw her?" The hostess seemed reluctant, but something in James's voice must have convinced her to at least try. She nodded and disappeared into the dining room, leaving James standing awkwardly by the door. He could feel the stares of the patrons boring into him, hear the whispers as they talked about the homeless man who had wandered into their sanctuary of wealth and privilege. It felt like an eternity before the hostess returned, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but no one remembers seeing anyone like that." James's heart sank, but he forced a smile. "Thank you for checking." He turned to leave, the weight of the ring in his pocket suddenly feeling heavier than before. As he stepped back out into the cold night, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe he should have kept the ring after all. But no, he couldn't think that way. He had made his choice, and he had to stick to it. As he walked down the street, he realized how alone he truly was. The city, with all its lights and noise, seemed indifferent to him, just as the people had been. But somewhere out there, the woman who had lost the ring was probably searching for it, panicked and desperate. He had to believe that returning it was the right thing to do, no matter how difficult it might be. Just as he was about to turn back and find a place to sleep for the night, he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. A flash of blonde hair, a familiar coat disappearing into a car parked at the edge of the street. His heart raced. It was her. Without thinking, James sprinted toward the car, shouting for her to stop. But the engine roared to life, and before he could reach her, the car sped away, leaving him standing in the middle of the street, breathless and defeated. For a moment, he considered giving up. The city was too big, and the chances of finding her again seemed impossibly slim. But then he felt the weight of the ring in his pocket, a reminder of the choice he had made. He couldn't give up now. This was only the beginning. James stood frozen in the middle of the street, watching the taillights of the car fade into the distance, his breath still ragged from the sprint. His heart pounded in his chest, the bitter cold of the night seeping into his bones, but all he could focus on was the missed opportunity. She had been right there, so close. He had almost reached her. But now, she was gone again. For a few moments, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. Doubts began creeping in, slowly at first, but growing louder with each passing second. He could have let it go, sold the ring, found a warm place to sleep, and left behind the hardships of the street. But now, what did he have to show for his choice? Nothing but frustration and exhaustion. The ring sat in his pocket like a leaden burden, reminding him of the choice he had made, a choice that was beginning to feel more and more like a mistake. James turned his gaze down the empty street, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. There was no way to know where the woman had gone, no way to trace her steps now that she had driven off into the night. The city was massive, and the odds of crossing paths with her again were slim. Still, the resolve that had driven him this far hadn't disappeared. Despite his doubt, there was something deep inside him that told him he couldn't give up. Not yet. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and then began walking, his feet moving almost mechanically. He had no destination, no clear path forward, but something told him to keep moving. If he stopped now, he feared the weight of the decision might crush him. The streets grew quieter as he walked further from the city center, the noise of traffic giving way to the soft hum of late-night life. Bars were beginning to close, and the last few stragglers stumbled out, laughing and chatting with friends. James kept his head down as he passed them, his mind focused on one thought. He had to find her. But how? The question gnawed at him with every step. He had no name, no address, no clue as to who she was or where she might have gone. All he had was the memory of her blonde hair, the expensive coat, and the brief moment of kindness she had shown him when she gave him money. That, and the ring now weighing heavily in his pocket. As he walked, James replayed the moment in his mind, searching for any detail he might have missed, anything that could help him track her down. He thought about the car she had gotten into, a luxury sedan, black, sleek, the kind of vehicle that only the wealthy drove. But that wasn't much to go on. In a city like this, there were hundreds of cars just like it, all belonging to people who moved in circles far removed from his own. Still, it was the only clue he had. His pace quickened, driven by the urgency of his mission. He knew that the longer he waited, the harder it would be to find her. He began walking toward the wealthier part of town, where upscale neighborhoods were filled with the kinds of people who frequented luxury restaurants like the one she had likely come from. It was a long shot, but he had to start somewhere. As he crossed the bridge that led into the more affluent district, the streets transformed before his eyes. The rough edges of the city faded into pristine sidewalks, lined with elegant streetlights and trimmed hedges. The houses here were massive, each one more opulent than the last, standing as silent monuments to wealth and privilege. James had walked through this neighborhood before, though never during the day, when it was bustling with activity. At night, it was quieter, the windows dark and the streets deserted, save for the occasional luxury car that passed by. He felt out of place here, as he always did. Even though the night had stripped the streets of most of their inhabitants, he could feel the weight of judgment in the air, the silent reminder that people like him didn't belong here. Still, he kept walking, his eyes scanning the houses and parked cars, hoping for some sign, some miracle that would lead him to the woman. But as the minutes dragged on and the silence deepened, that hope began to wane. He passed house after house, each one looking more imposing than the last, but there was no sign of her. The city felt larger than ever, and the more he walked, the more distant his goal seemed to become. He stopped for a moment, leaning against a wrought iron fence, his breath coming in heavy puffs in the cold night air. His legs ached from the hours of walking, and his body screamed for rest, but his mind was too restless to stop. He looked up at the mansion in front of him, a towering structure with columns that rose up like sentinels guarding the entrance. There was a sleek black sedan parked in the driveway, but it wasn't the car he was looking for. This wasn't her house. With a frustrated sigh, James pushed himself off the fence and continued on, his steps slower now, weighed down by the increasing sense of futility. Maybe it had been a mistake to come here. Maybe he had been wrong to think he could find her in a place like this. But where else could he go? He turned down another street, this one lined with more expensive homes, their lawns perfectly manicured and their driveways filled with luxury cars. It was a world so far removed from his own that it almost felt like a dream, or a nightmare. He had once dreamed of living in a place like this, back when he still had a job and a family, back when he believed that hard work could lead to success. But that dream had died long ago, buried beneath the weight of his failures and the crushing reality of the world he lived in. Suddenly, a car pulled out of a driveway ahead of him, the headlights cutting through the darkness. It was another luxury sedan, black and sleek, just like the one the woman had driven off in earlier. For a moment his heart leapt, and he quickened his pace, hoping against hope that it was her. But as he got closer, the car turned the corner and disappeared from view, leaving him once again standing alone in the cold, empty street. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the weight of disappointment settling over him like a heavy blanket. It felt like the night was closing in on him, the cold seeping into his bones. And for the first time since he had set out on this search, James wondered if it was all for nothing. He had no leads, no idea where she might be, and the longer he searched, the more impossible the task seemed. He stopped at the corner of the street, leaning against a street lamp for support. His body was aching now, his feet sore from the hours of walking, but more than the physical exhaustion, it was the mental strain that was wearing him down. The weight of the ring in his pocket felt heavier with each passing minute, a constant reminder of the responsibility he had taken on. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, holding it up to the light. The diamond sparkled, even in the dim glow of the street lamp, its beauty undeniable. This small piece of jewelry could change his life in an instant. He could sell it, walk away from all of this, and finally have the money to start over. No one would ever know. No one would blame him. But as he stared at the ring, he felt the familiar tug of his conscience. He couldn't do it. No matter how tempting it was, no matter how much he needed the money, he couldn't bring himself to keep something that wasn't his. It went against everything he believed in, everything his father had taught him. He slipped the ring back into his pocket and straightened up, determined to keep searching. He didn't know how long it would take, or if he would ever find her, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He had made a choice, and he was going to see it through. James turned down another street, his steps slow but steady, his eyes scanning the houses and cars for any sign of the woman. The night stretched on, the cold biting at his skin, but he kept moving, driven by the need to do what was right. Hours passed, and still there was no sign of her. The city was vast, and his chances of finding her felt smaller with each passing minute, but James refused to give up. He had come too far to turn back now. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the city, James found himself standing at the edge of a park. He had wandered far from the wealthy neighborhoods now, back into the heart of the city, where the buildings were older and the streets less pristine. The park was quiet, the grass wet with dew, and the air filled with the faint sound of birds waking to the new day. James sat down on a bench, his body aching from the long night of searching. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He had failed. He hadn't found her, and now the night was over. But as he sat there, staring out at the empty park, something inside him shifted. He had done everything he could. He had tried, and maybe that was enough. He would keep the ring safe, and when the time came, he would find a way to return it. Maybe he hadn't found her tonight, but that didn't mean he wouldn't find her eventually. He just had to be patient. With a deep breath, James stood up from the bench and began walking again, his steps slower now, but no less determined. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Days passed, and with each one, James grew more resigned to the possibility that he might never find the woman. He continued his search, wandering the streets of the city whenever he could, always keeping an eye out for the telltale signs of her presence: the blonde hair, the expensive coat, the black sedan. But despite his best efforts, she seemed to have vanished without a trace. He spent his nights in shelters when he could find space, and on the street when he couldn't. The cold grew harsher as winter approached, and every morning brought with it the challenge of surviving another day without losing hope. The weight of the ring in his pocket remained a constant reminder of the choice he had made, and though he didn't regret it, he couldn't help but feel the gnawing frustration of his fruitless search. One evening, as he huddled under the awning of a small grocery store to escape the biting wind, James watched the bustling city around him. People hurried by, their collars turned up against the chill, and for a moment he allowed himself to wonder what it would be like to be one of them, to walk these streets with purpose, with a destination in mind, instead of wandering aimlessly. Just as he was lost in thought, a voice broke through the hum of the street. "Excuse me, sir, could you spare some change?" James looked up and saw a young woman standing a few feet away from him. She was dressed in a worn coat, her face pale and tired, her eyes filled with the same kind of desperation that he saw in his own reflection every day. For a brief moment their eyes met, and James felt a surge of empathy. He had been in her shoes before, still was, in many ways. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I don't have much myself." The woman nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "It's okay. Thanks anyway." As she turned to walk away, something tugged at James, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. He hesitated for a moment, then called after her. "Wait." The woman stopped and looked back at him, her expression weary but curious. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handful of coins, the little money he had managed to scrape together over the past few days. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. "Here," he said, holding out the coins. "It's not a lot, but maybe it'll help." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she hesitated. Then, with a grateful smile, she reached out and took the coins. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea how much this means." James nodded, watching as she disappeared into the crowd. As she walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't found the woman he was searching for, but in that small moment of kindness, he had done something good. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still room for humanity, for compassion. He sighed, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as the wind picked up again. He needed to find shelter for the night, and as he looked around, he spotted a nearby cafe. The warm glow from its windows beckoned him, and though he had no money left for food, he hoped he might at least find a place to rest for a few minutes, to warm up before the long night ahead. As he approached the cafe, the door swung open, and a group of people emerged, laughing and chatting as they spilled out onto the sidewalk. James stepped aside to let them pass, but as he did, something caught his eye. There, in the group, was a woman with blonde hair dressed in an expensive coat. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be her? He hesitated for only a second before he followed, keeping his distance as the group made their way down the street. His mind raced with questions. Was this really her, or was his mind playing tricks on him again? He had seen so many women with blonde hair over the past few days, always thinking it might be her, only to be disappointed. But something about this felt different. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke to the people around her, it matched the brief memory he had of the woman who had given him money that night, the same woman who had dropped the diamond ring. He quickened his pace, trying to get a better look at her without drawing attention to himself. The group reached the corner of the street and stopped, talking among themselves as they waited for the light to change. James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and stepped closer. He was almost certain now. It had to be her. Just as he was about to approach, the woman turned her head, and James saw her face clearly for the first time. His breath caught in his throat. It was her. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The woman turned, her expression polite but puzzled as she looked at him. For a moment she didn't seem to recognize him, but then her eyes widened in surprise, and her hand flew to her mouth. "It's you," she said, her voice soft with disbelief. "You're the man from that night." James nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, I've been trying to find you." The woman blinked, still processing the situation. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize—" "I have something of yours," James interrupted, his voice filled with urgency. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, holding it up for her to see. The diamond caught the light, sparkling as brightly as the night he had found it. The woman gasped, her hand trembling as she reached out to take the ring. "My ring," she whispered. I thought I'd lost it forever." James watched as she slipped the ring back onto her finger, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have kept this. You could have—" "I couldn't," James said quietly. "It wasn't mine to keep." For a moment there was silence between them, the noise of the city fading into the background as they stood there, two strangers connected by an act of honesty and kindness. The woman wiped away a tear, her voice shaking as she spoke. "You don't understand what this means to me," she said. "This ring, it's not just valuable. It belonged to my mother. It's everything." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had seen the value in the ring, but now he realized it had a significance far beyond its material worth. This ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of something deeper, something irreplaceable. The woman took a deep breath, composing herself. "I want to help you," she said suddenly, her voice firm with determination. "You've done something incredible, and I can't let that go unnoticed." James shook his head. "You don't have to—" "No," she interrupted, her eyes filled with conviction. "I want to. Please, let me help you." Before James could protest, the woman stepped forward, taking his hand in hers. "Come with me," she said. "Let's go somewhere warm. We'll talk." James hesitated for a moment, the weight of his pride holding him back. But something in her eyes, the sincerity, the kindness, told him that this was a chance he couldn't refuse. He had spent so long searching, not just for her, but for a way out of the life he had been trapped in. And now, in this unexpected moment, that way out was being offered to him. He nodded slowly, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope, and followed the woman as she led him down the street, away from the cold and the darkness, toward a future he had almost given up on. As they walked, James felt the weight of the past few days lift from his shoulders, replaced by something new, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The warmth of the cafe was a welcome change from the biting cold outside. As James stepped through the door behind the woman, he felt the tension in his body begin to ease, though his mind remained alert, still grappling with the strangeness of the situation. The faint hum of quiet conversations and the clink of mugs created an atmosphere of comfort and familiarity, something James hadn't experienced in what felt like an eternity. The woman guided him to a small table near the window, where they both sat down. She took off her coat and draped it over the back of her chair, revealing a soft wool sweater beneath. She looked at James, her expression still a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened, the returned ring, the long search, seemed to hang between them, both unsure of how to move forward. A waitress came by to take their order, and James glanced at the menu. It had been so long since he'd had a proper meal that even the simplest dish seemed overwhelming. Before he could decide, the woman ordered 2 bowls of soup and some coffee for them both, then turned her attention back to him. "My name is Sarah," she said softly, extending her hand. I realize I never introduced myself properly the last time we met. James shook her hand gently, nodding. James, it's good to meet you, Sarah. She smiled, but it was a sad smile, as if she was still trying to process everything that had led them to this moment. I can't believe you found me. I was sure I'd never see that ring again, and I was just as sure I'd never see you again. James leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the ring no longer in his pocket, but in the memories of the past few days. I didn't think I'd find you either. I wasn't even sure where to start. But I couldn't keep it. That's not who I am. Sarah nodded, her gaze softening. I know, and that's why I need to help you. The waitress returned with their soup, and as the steam from the bowls rose between them, James realized just how hungry he was. His stomach growled in protest, and he wasted no time in taking a sip of the hot broth. The warmth spread through him instantly, like a fire being lit inside his chest. Sarah watched him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Tell me about yourself, James. How did you end up where you are? James hesitated, unsure how much of his story to share. It had been a long time since anyone had asked about his life, let alone cared enough to listen. But something about Sarah's sincerity made him feel like he could trust her. I wasn't always like this, he began quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of pain. I used to have a job, a family, a life. But things started falling apart a few years ago. I worked in construction, but when the company downsized, I was one of the first to go. They never said it outright, but I knew it was because of the color of my skin. They kept the younger white workers and let me go. He paused, the memories flooding back with a sharp sting. After that, I couldn't find work. No one wanted to hire a middle-aged black man with no formal education. The bills piled up and, eventually, my wife left me. She took our son, and I haven't seen them since. I ended up on the streets not long after that. Sarah listened intently, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if grounding herself against the sadness of his story. She didn't interrupt, letting him take his time. James sighed, his voice growing quieter. It wasn't just losing my job or my family. It was the way people treated me afterward. The stares, the assumptions, the way they looked at me like I was some kind of criminal just because I had nowhere to go. It wears you down after a while, makes you start believing that maybe they're right. Maybe you are worth less because of where you've ended up. He shook his head, looking down at the table. But I couldn't let myself believe that. I couldn't become what they thought I was. That's why, when I found your ring, I knew I had to return it. It was the right thing to do. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and steady. You're worth more than they think, James, and you've done more than most people would. You didn't just return the ring, you made a choice to hold on to your integrity, even when no one would have known if you hadn't. James didn't know what to say. Her words touched him in a way he hadn't expected. He had grown so used to being invisible, to being judged, that hearing someone recognize his worth felt almost foreign to him. I want to help you, Sarah continued, her voice filled with determination. You've given me something irreplaceable, and I can't just walk away from this without doing something for you in return. Let me help you get back on your feet. James hesitated, his pride wrestling with his desperation. It had been so long since anyone had offered him a hand, and the thought of accepting help felt both like a lifeline and a burden. He had spent years trying to survive on his own, trying not to rely on anyone, because the world had taught him that no one could be relied upon. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw no pity, no judgment, just kindness. And in that moment, he realized that maybe it was okay to accept help, that maybe this was his second chance. What do you have in mind? He asked cautiously. Sarah smiled, relieved that he hadn't outright refused. First, we'll get you into a proper place to stay. No more sleeping on the streets or in shelters. I know someone who manages an apartment complex. I'm sure we can arrange something for you, at least for the short term. James blinked in surprise. An apartment? Yes, she said firmly. You need a place to call your own, Somewhere safe where you can start rebuilding your life. And I'll help you find a job. I know people who can help with that too. You deserve the chance to start fresh, James." The idea of having a roof over his head again, a place to call his own, felt almost too good to be true. It had been so long since he'd had that kind of security, and though he wanted to believe it was possible, part of him feared it would all disappear as quickly as it had come. But Sarah wasn't done. "I'm also going to tell your story," she said, her eyes lighting up with purpose. "The world needs to know what you did, how you returned the ring, how you made this incredible choice, even when it would have been so easy not to. People need to see that there's still goodness in the world, that integrity and honesty matter, and I think your story will inspire others." James felt a pang of unease at the idea of his story being shared with the world. He wasn't used to attention, and the thought of his face and his past being exposed for everyone to see made him uncomfortable. But at the same time, he understood what she was saying. Maybe his story could make a difference, not just for him, but for others who had been judged and cast aside like he had. "I don't know," he began, but Sarah cut him off gently. "You don't have to decide right now," she said, "but think about it. This is a chance not just to change your life, but to show people that there's more to someone than what they see on the surface." James nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. The idea of telling his story, of being seen for who he truly was, rather than the assumptions people made about him, was terrifying. But maybe it was also the key to something bigger, something that could help him find his way back to the man he had once been. The conversation drifted into quieter topics as they finished their meal. Sarah asking more about his past, his dreams, the things he had once hoped for before life had taken everything from him. And for the first time in years, James allowed himself to dream again, to imagine a life beyond the streets, a life where he could have a job, a home, and maybe even reconnect with the family he had lost. As they left the cafe and stepped back into the cold night air, Sarah turned to him with a smile. "This is just the beginning, James. We'll figure this out together." James looked at her, feeling something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change for the better. And as he followed Sarah down the street toward a future that no longer seemed so bleak, he knew that he was ready to take that chance. This was his new beginning. The next morning, James woke up in a small but comfortable apartment, sunlight streaming through the window. For a brief moment, he thought it was a dream. The softness of the bed, the warmth of the blanket wrapped around him. It was all so unfamiliar, so different from the cold, hard ground he had become used to. But as he blinked away the sleep and sat up, he realized it was real. This was his life now. He still couldn't quite believe how quickly everything had changed. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been wandering the streets, hopeless and alone, with no idea what the future held. And now, thanks to Sarah, he had a roof over his head, a place to sleep, and the promise of more help to come. James swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. From this vantage point, everything seemed different, brighter somehow. The streets that had once felt so cold and hostile now seemed full of possibility. A knock at the door broke him from his thoughts, and he turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning," she said with a smile, handing him one of the cups. "I thought you might need this." James took the cup gratefully, the warmth spreading through his fingers. "Thank you," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. I still can't believe all of this is happening." Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression soft but determined. "You deserve it, James. You made a choice that most people wouldn't have. You could have kept that ring, and no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. That says a lot about who you are." James nodded, though he still found it hard to accept. "It just felt like the right thing to do. And that's exactly why I want to share your story," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up with purpose. "People need to hear about this. They need to see that there's still good in the world, even when things seem darkest. James shifted uncomfortably, the idea of his story being shared with the world still feeling strange to him. He had spent so long being invisible, and now Sarah wanted to shine a light on his life in a way that made him feel vulnerable. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the possibility that maybe his story could make a difference, not just for him, but for others who had been through similar struggles. How would it work? He asked hesitantly. Sarah smiled, sensing that he was warming up to the idea. I know some people in the media. I could talk to them, share what happened, and see if they're interested in doing a story on it. We'd keep your privacy in mind, of course. But I think if people hear about what you did, how you chose honesty over survival, it could inspire them. Maybe it could even help change the way people think about homelessness. James considered her words carefully. He hadn't thought about it that way before, but now that she said it, he realized she was right. There were so many misconceptions about people like him, about homelessness, about race, about how someone could fall so far, so quickly. If sharing his story could help even one person see things differently, then maybe it was worth it. Okay, he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. Let's do it. Sarah's smile widened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. Thank you, James. You're doing something important here, and I promise we'll do this the right way. Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly to make the arrangements. She contacted a local news station explaining the story, and they quickly expressed interest. It wasn't every day that they heard a story like James's, and the human interest angle was too compelling to pass up. They agreed to interview him, and soon enough, plans were in motion for a feature piece that would air on the evening news. The day of the interview arrived quicker than James expected. He stood in front of a mirror in the small apartment, staring at his reflection. Sarah had taken him shopping the day before to buy some new clothes, and now he was dressed in a clean shirt and slacks, looking more like the man he used to be than the one he had become. But as he gazed at his reflection, he still felt the weight of the past few years on his shoulders, the scars of everything he had been through still fresh in his mind. Are you ready? Sarah's voice came from the doorway, and James turned to see her standing there, a supportive smile on her face. He took a deep breath and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. The news crew had set up in a nearby park, a peaceful spot where they could film without too much distraction. The reporter, a young woman with a warm demeanor, introduced herself to James and explained how the interview would go. They would ask him about his life, about the decision to return the ring, and about the journey that had led him here. She reassured him that it was meant to be a positive piece, a story of hope and redemption. As the cameras rolled, James felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. He had never been in front of a camera before, never had the spotlight on him like this. But as the interview began, he found himself easing into it, his nerves fading as he spoke from the heart. He told them everything, about his job, his family, the struggles he had faced after losing everything, and how the world had treated him since. He spoke about the ring, about the internal conflict he had felt, and about how returning it had been the only choice he could live with. Throughout the interview, Sarah stood just off camera, her presence a source of comfort and support. She smiled at him whenever their eyes met, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone in this. By the time the interview ended, James felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his chest, and though he wasn't sure what would come next, he knew that sharing his story had been the right thing to do. The news piece aired that evening, and the response was immediate. People all over the city and even beyond were touched by James's story. Social media buzzed with comments about his honesty, his integrity, and the difficult choice he had made. Some called him a hero, while others praised Sarah for helping him get back on his feet. But the most unexpected reaction came from someone James hadn't seen in years: his son. The day after the story aired, James was sitting in his apartment, still trying to process the flood of responses from strangers, when his phone buzzed with a message. He hadn't received a personal message in so long that it took him a moment to register what it was. When he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. "Dad, is that you?" The message was from a number he didn't recognize, but the name attached to it sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. It was his son, Tyler. James stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent years wondering if he would ever see or hear from his family again, and now, out of nowhere, his son had reached out. Tyler. He typed the name slowly, his fingers trembling. "Yes, it's me. I've been trying to find you for so long." There was a long pause, and for a moment James feared that Tyler wouldn't respond. But then the phone buzzed again, and when he read the message, tears welled up in his eyes. "I saw you on the news, Dad. I can't believe it's really you. I've missed you so much." James wiped away a tear, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling. His son, the boy he had lost, the boy he had thought he might never see again, had found him. After all these years, after all the pain and separation, they were connected again. He typed quickly, his hands shaking. "I've missed you too, Tyler. I never stopped thinking about you. Where are you? Can we meet?" Another pause, but this time it didn't feel so long. The response came quickly, and it brought with it a surge of hope. "I'm in town. I want to see you." James sat back, his heart racing. It was happening. His son was here, in the same city, and they were going to meet again. He looked up as Sarah walked into the room, her eyes immediately going to his tear-streaked face. "James? What happened?" James smiled, unable to contain the overwhelming joy he felt. "It's my son. He saw the news. He's here. He wants to see me." Sarah's face lit up with a smile, and she crossed the room to hug him. "That's amazing, James. I'm so happy for you." James nodded, his emotions still swirling inside him. He had spent so long searching, not just for Sarah, but for a way to reconnect with his family, to rebuild the life he had lost. And now, in the most unexpected way, that moment had finally arrived. As he typed out a message to Tyler, arranging a time and place to meet, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He had been through so much, had lost so much, but now, slowly, piece by piece, his life was being restored. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something good after all. This was the ripple effect of one honest choice, and it was changing everything. The next morning, James stood at the entrance of the park, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the anticipation that had been building inside him since the moment he had received that message from his son. His heart felt like it was pounding in his throat, each beat filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He hadn't seen Tyler in years. The last time they had been together, Tyler had been a boy, just 8 years old, innocent and full of life. Now, he was a young man, probably with a life of his own, shaped by experiences James hadn't been part of. The thought filled him with both excitement and anxiety. Would Tyler even recognize him? Would he want to hear what James had to say? Or would he carry resentment for all the years they had been apart? The park was quiet, the trees shedding their golden leaves, which crunched underfoot as James shifted from one leg to the other, trying to calm himself. He checked his phone for what felt like the 100th time, seeing the last message from Tyler confirming their meeting. 10 a.m. at the park near the fountain. "I'll be there." It was 9:58. James scanned the park, his eyes moving over the paths and benches, searching for any sign of his son. There were a few joggers, an older couple walking their dog, and a woman pushing a stroller, but no Tyler. The minutes stretched on, each one making the tension in his chest grow heavier. He tried to steady his breathing, telling himself that Tyler would show up, that everything would be okay. But it had been so long. What if he had changed his mind? Suddenly, James saw a figure approaching in the distance. His breath caught in his throat as the young man walked closer, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders slightly hunched against the chill. He had dark hair, just like James remembered, though it was longer now, curling slightly at the ends. And though he was taller, his face was still familiar. The same eyes, the same determined expression that James had seen in his son's face as a child. It was Tyler. James froze, unable to move as his son came closer. The moment felt surreal, like a dream he had imagined countless times but never thought would actually happen. Tyler's eyes met his, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Tyler stopped in front of him. "Dad?" Tyler's voice was quiet, uncertain, as if he, too, was struggling to believe this moment was real. James swallowed hard, emotions welling up in his chest. "Tyler, it's me. His voice faltered. There was so much he wanted to say, but the words stuck in his throat, overwhelmed by the weight of the years that had passed. For a long moment they just stood there, staring at each other, both unsure of how to bridge the gap that time and distance had created between them. James could see the questions in Tyler's eyes, the hurt that lingered beneath the surface, and it broke his heart. He wanted to reach out, to hold his son and tell him how sorry he was, but he wasn't sure if Tyler was ready for that. Finally, Tyler spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." James felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded slowly. "I didn't think I'd ever see you either. I've missed you so much, Tyler. Every day." Tyler's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment, as if trying to compose himself. When he looked back at James, his eyes were filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back for us?" James felt the weight of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known this question was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. He had spent so many sleepless nights thinking about what he would say if this moment ever came, but now that it was here, all those rehearsed explanations seemed hollow. "I didn't want to leave," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost everything, Tyler. My job, the house, everything. And then your mom left with you. I tried to find you, I swear, but I was already on the street by then. I had nothing. I thought you'd be better off without me." Tyler's expression hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. "Better off without you? I needed you, Dad. I didn't care about the money or the house or any of that. I just wanted my dad." James felt the sting of those words deep in his heart. He had made so many mistakes, and hearing them voiced by the one person he had tried to protect made it all the more painful. "I know I failed you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I was wrong. I should have fought harder to stay in your life. I should have been there for you." For a moment, Tyler didn't respond. He stood there, staring at James with a mixture of emotions flickering across his face. James braced himself for the anger, the rejection that he felt he deserved. But then, something shifted in Tyler's expression, and the hardness in his eyes softened. "You really tried to find me?" Tyler asked, his voice barely a whisper. James nodded. "I did. I searched for you for years, but I didn't know where you were. Your mom moved and I couldn't track you down. I never gave up hope, though, not for 1 second." Tyler swallowed, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I thought you didn't care. I thought you just left us behind." James felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, and he took a step forward, his voice full of raw emotion. "I never stopped caring, Tyler. Not for a second. You were the only thing that kept me going all these years. I thought about you every day, wondering if you were okay, if you were happy." He hesitated, his throat tightening with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your life now. If you'll let me." Tyler stood there in silence, his shoulders tense as he processed his father's words. The pain of their separation still lingered, but James could see something else in his eyes now. Something softer, more vulnerable. It was as if the wall Tyler had built around himself was starting to crack. Finally, Tyler looked up at James, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know how to feel about all of this, Dad. I spent so many years thinking you didn't want me, and now, It's just a lot to take in. James nodded, understanding. I know it is, and I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight. I just want a chance to make things right. Tyler looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. Let's take it slow. James felt a surge of relief wash over him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild the relationship he had lost with his son. It wouldn't be easy. There were years of hurt and distance between them, but the fact that Tyler was willing to try meant everything to him. Thank you, James whispered, his voice full of gratitude. That's all I ask. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer heavy with pain, but filled with the tentative beginnings of something new. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Do you want to go for a walk? Tyler asked after a moment, gesturing toward the path that wound through the park. James smiled, feeling the weight of his past start to lift. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. As they walked side by side, talking about the years they had missed and the things they still needed to say, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. For so long, he had carried the guilt of his past, the pain of losing his family. But now, for the first time, he felt like there was a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, James believed that there was hope for healing. They walked for hours, talking and laughing, sharing stories from their separate lives. Tyler told James about his school, his friends, and how he had been trying to figure out what to do with his life. James listened intently, soaking in every detail, grateful for the chance to be part of his son's life again. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park, James realized that this moment, this simple walk with his son, was more precious than anything he could have ever imagined. It was a second chance, not just to reconnect with Tyler, but to build something new, something stronger than what had come before. When they finally said goodbye, promising to meet again soon, James felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't felt in years. He had spent so long searching for answers, for redemption, and now, standing at the edge of the park as Tyler walked away, he realized that the journey was just beginning. As he walked back to his apartment, the city lights twinkling in the distance, James thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The ring, the search for Sarah, the kindness she had. As James walked back to the small apartment that Sarah had helped him secure, he couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey of the past few weeks. The weight of his old life, the hardship, the loss, the isolation, seemed to finally be lifting. He had reconnected with his son, and for the first time in years, hope wasn't just a distant dream, but something real, tangible, and within his reach. The city around him bustled with life, people moving past him, cars honking in the distance, but James felt a calm that he hadn't experienced in a long time. His meeting with Tyler had filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. He now had something to look forward to, something worth fighting for. The pain and the struggles that had once defined his existence were no longer chains around his heart. They were becoming memories of a life he was leaving behind. As he approached the apartment building, he saw Sarah waiting for him outside, her face lighting up as soon as she spotted him. She had been the beacon of light through all of this, the person who had given him the chance to rebuild his life, and James couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, her voice warm with curiosity as she walked toward him. James smiled, the kind of smile that comes when something deep inside begins to heal. "It went better than I could have hoped. Tyler, he wants to take things slow, but he's open to reconnecting. I couldn't ask for more." Sarah's face softened, and she reached out to give him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "I'm so glad to hear that, James. You deserve this. A chance to heal, a chance to rebuild your life." They walked together into the apartment, the late afternoon light spilling into the small but cozy space. Sarah set her bag down on the table and turned back to James, her expression thoughtful. "You know, your story has been getting a lot of attention." James raised an eyebrow. Attention? What do you mean? Sarah smiled. The news piece we did. It's gone viral. People are talking about it all over social media. Your story is inspiring people, James. They're moved by your honesty, by your choice to return the ring. I've gotten calls from several different news outlets. They want to do more stories, interviews. I even had someone reach out about writing an article for a magazine. James blinked, taken aback by the news. He had agreed to share his story with the hope that it might inspire a few people, but he had never imagined it would spread like this. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Sarah said, her voice gentle. This is happening because you chose to do the right thing. People see that, and it gives them hope. It reminds them that even when the world seems broken, there are still good people out there, people like you, who make a difference. James shook his head, still processing the idea that his story, his life, had touched so many people. I never thought my life would matter to anyone. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes full of warmth. But it does. You've been through so much, and yet you held on to your integrity, your decency. That's something people need to see, need to believe in. James felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long he had been invisible, overlooked by society, judged and discarded. And now his story, the simple act of doing what was right, was being recognized. It was almost too much to take in. With everything that's happened, I think it's time we take things a step further, Sarah said, breaking through his thoughts. She sat down at the small kitchen table, gesturing for James to join her. There's a lot of attention on you right now, and I think we can use that to help even more people. James sat down across from her, intrigued. What do you have in mind? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, something that could help people who are in the same position you were in, people who've lost everything, who feel like the world has given up on them. We could provide housing, job training, mental health support, whatever it takes to help people get back on their feet. James stared at her, surprised by the scope of what she was suggesting. A foundation? But how would we even start something like that? Sarah smiled. We already have the attention of the public. People are invested in your story, and I think a lot of them would be willing to help. We could raise money, partner with local organizations, and really make a difference. This is bigger than just you or me. This is about changing lives. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The idea of starting a foundation, of helping others who had experienced the same struggles he had, was something he had never even considered. But now that Sarah had planted the seed, he could see the potential. There were so many people like him, people who had lost their homes, their jobs, their families, and they deserved a second chance, just like he had gotten. I don't know what to say, he said, shaking his head. I've spent so long just trying to survive. I never thought about helping others like this. That's why I'm here, Sarah said, her voice full of determination. We can do this together. You have the story, the experience, and I have the connections. We can make something that lasts, something that truly changes lives. James looked down at his hands, the scars of his past still visible in the lines on his palms. For so long, he had believed that his life was defined by failure, by the things he had lost. But now, for the first time, he saw the possibility of something greater, not just for himself, but for others like him. You really think we can do this? He asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I know we can. Your story has already changed lives, James. This is just the next step. James nodded slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. He had spent so many years feeling powerless, but now, with Sarah's help, he saw the potential to turn his pain into something meaningful. He could help others avoid the mistakes he had made, offer them the support he had lacked, and give them the chance to rebuild their lives, just as he was now rebuilding his own. Okay, he said quietly, the decision settling in his heart. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, James and Sarah worked tirelessly to lay the groundwork for the foundation. They met with local organizations, raised funds through donations, and began forming partnerships with shelters and job training programs. The media attention continued to grow, with more outlets picking up James's story and sharing it with their audiences. People were moved by his journey, and many were eager to help. Through it all, James remained humble, still in awe of how quickly his life had transformed. He had gone from being invisible on the streets to being a voice for those who had been forgotten. And as the foundation began to take shape, he realized that this was his purpose: to give back, to help others find the hope that he had once lost. One evening, as James and Sarah sat in the office of their newly formed foundation, surrounded by papers and plans for the future, James took a moment to reflect on everything that had brought him to this point. The ring, the choice to return it, the connection with Sarah. It had all led to this. And now, as he looked at the future that lay ahead, he knew that it was just the beginning. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, glancing at him with a smile as she shuffled through some papers. James nodded, a quiet confidence settling over him. "Yeah, I'm ready." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. As the days turned into weeks and the foundation continued to grow, James saw the ripple effect of his decision spreading further than he could have ever imagined. People were reaching out, offering support, sharing their own stories of hardship and hope. And through it all, James remained committed to the mission he and Sarah had started: to give people the chance to rebuild their lives, just as he had been given that chance. His journey had come full circle. From the streets to the foundation, from loss to redemption, James had found not just a second chance at life, but a way to help others find theirs. And as he walked through the doors of the foundation's office every morning, greeted by the faces of people whose lives were being changed, James knew that he had found his purpose. This was his redemption. This was his legacy. And it all started with one honest choice. Thanks for watching. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Give it a like, leave a comment, and share this video with your friends. Also, check out our other videos. Each one tells a unique story that makes you think and touches your heart. Where did you watch this story? Write it in the comments. We'd love to know.